A Marine returns home after years of service, seeking peace and a fresh start. But what he finds on the road will test his strength, courage, and resolve like never before. What happens when a man who refuses to back down faces a challenge he never expected? Stay with us to see how this journey unfolds. If this story inspires or moves you, leave your thoughts in the comments and share the video. Let's talk about standing up for what's right. The road stretched endlessly before him, a long, empty path leading back to a place he hadn't seen in years. Thomas Williams, a Marine who had spent most of his adult life in uniform, was finally heading home. The years in the military had sharpened his body and mind, leaving him with a discipline few could match, but also with an emptiness he struggled to understand. The war had taken its toll, and the things he had seen and done had left their marks. Now he yearned for peace, for the simplicity of home, even if it meant confronting the ghosts of the past. The purr of his old pickup truck was the only sound on the deserted highway. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun bathed the surrounding fields in gold. Thomas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts drifting. He hadn't been back in years, not since his mother's funeral. His father, a proud but stubborn man, had stayed behind, and their relationship had grown distant. They hadn't spoken in so long that Thomas wasn't sure what awaited him in the small town he once called home. As the truck rumbled on, Thomas noticed a faint noise in the distance. At first, it seemed like the distant rumble of an approaching storm, but as he drew closer, the noise grew louder. It wasn't thunder, it was laughter, rough, grating, and cruel. He slowed the truck and peered ahead. By the side of the road, he spotted a group of bikers, their leather jackets gleaming in the sun. They were gathered in a circle, surrounding someone, a frail figure hunched on the ground. Thomas pulled over, his heart tightening as he watched the scene unfold. The bikers were jeering and laughing, throwing insults at the man in the center. He was an older black man, his clothes worn and tattered, clutching a small backpack to his chest as though it were his most precious possession. One of the bikers snatched the backpack from him, tossing it to another as if it were a toy. The anger that surged through Thomas was immediate and visceral. He had seen men like these before, bullies who thrived on power over the vulnerable. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel as he made his way toward the group. "Hey!" His voice boomed across the distance, cutting through their laughter. The bikers turned, their expressions shifting from amusement to irritation as they sized him up. The leader of the group, a tall, burly man with a patchy beard, stepped forward. "Who the hell are you?" he sneered. "Think you can just walk up and play hero?" Thomas's gaze didn't waver. "I said, leave him alone." The bikers exchanged glances before bursting into laughter. The leader spread his arms mockingly. "Or what? You gonna call the cops? Go ahead, they don't care." Thomas didn't answer. His stance, calm but firm, spoke volumes. The tension crackled in the air as the bikers realized he wasn't backing down. The leader scowled. "Fine. You want a piece of this? Let's see what you've got." The first biker lunged at Thomas, but his movements were clumsy, driven by anger rather than skill. Thomas sidestepped easily, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back before shoving him to the ground. Another biker rushed in, swinging wildly. Thomas ducked and countered with a quick strike to the ribs, sending the man staggering. The fight escalated quickly. 2 more bikers charged, their punches coming in rapid succession. Thomas moved with precision, blocking their blows and retaliating with calculated strikes that left them on the ground, groaning in pain. The leader watched, his anger turning to something closer to fear. He pulled out a knife, the blade glinting in the fading sunlight. "You're gonna regret this," he growled, advancing on Thomas. Thomas's eyes narrowed. As the leader lunged, Thomas stepped forward, deflecting the knife with his forearm and twisting the man's wrist until the weapon clattered to the ground. With a swift kick, he sent the knife skidding across the pavement. The leader roared in frustration, throwing a punch that Thomas dodged effortlessly. Grabbing the man by his jacket, Thomas yanked him forward and delivered a forceful shove, sending him sprawling to the ground. "Enough," Thomas said, his voice cold and steady. "Walk away now, or you'll wish you had." The bikers hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. The leader, nursing his bruises, finally spat on the ground and motioned for his crew to retreat. "This isn't over," he snarled before they mounted their bikes and roared off into the distance. Thomas exhaled, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He turned to the old man who was sitting on the ground, his hands trembling as he clutched his backpack. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked, kneeling beside him. The man looked up, his face weathered but dignified, and for a moment Thomas felt a jolt of recognition. His heart skipped a beat as he stared into the man's eyes, realizing with growing disbelief who he was looking at. "Tommy," the man whispered, his voice hoarse. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. "Dad?" Thomas froze, his mind reeling as he stared at the old man in front of him. The years had aged him. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, his eyes clouded with exhaustion, but there was no mistaking him. This was Harold Williams, his father, the man he hadn't seen in over a decade. For a moment, the noise of the world seemed to fade, replaced by the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Dad?" Thomas repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Harold nodded slowly, his lips trembling. "It's me, Tommy. It's been a long time." The words hit Thomas like a freight train. He had spent years trying not to think about his father, about the anger and disappointment that had driven them apart, but seeing him now, frail and vulnerable, all of that seemed to dissolve, replaced by a mix of shock and concern. Thomas crouched down, his military instincts kicking in. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "Did they hurt you?" Harold shook his head, though his hands still trembled as they gripped the straps of his battered backpack. "I'm fine. Just shaken up, that's all. You really came back." Before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. A police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing as two officers stepped out. The younger of the two, a rookie by the look of him, glanced at the scene with wide eyes. The older officer, more seasoned, surveyed the situation with a calm but wary expression. "What happened here?" the older officer asked, his gaze flicking between Thomas and Harold. Thomas stood, his posture firm. "Those bikers," he said, gesturing toward the direction they had fled. "They attacked this man, tried to rob him. I stepped in." The officer nodded, pulling out a notepad. "Did you get a good look at them?" "Better than that," Thomas replied. "They'll have bruises to match." The rookie smirked but quickly straightened when his partner shot him a warning glance. Harold, still seated on the ground, looked up at the officers. "He's telling the truth," he said, his voice steadier now. "Those men were tormenting me. If Tommy hadn't shown up—" His voice trailed off and he shook his head. "We'll file a report," the older officer said, his tone professional. "Do you need medical attention, sir?" Harold shook his head. "I'll be fine." After a few more questions, the officers left to track down the bikers, leaving Thomas and Harold alone on the side of the road. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the area in a soft, dusky glow. Thomas turned to his father, his expression softening. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you out of here." Harold hesitated, glancing down at his worn shoes. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Thomas said firmly. "Let's go." He helped Harold into the truck, noting how thin and frail his father had become. The drive back into town was silent at first, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Harold broke the silence. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," he said, his voice low. Thomas tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Neither did I." Harold sighed, staring out the window. "A lot's changed since you left." Thomas glanced at him. "I can see that." "What happened, Dad? Why are you out here? Why didn't you tell me things had gotten this bad?" Harold didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was tinged with shame. "After your mother passed, I lost my way. The house, the job, everything just fell apart. I didn't want you to know, didn't want you to see me like this." Thomas swallowed hard, guilt gnawing at him. "You didn't have to go through it alone. I could have helped. You had your own life, your own battles to fight," Harold said quietly. "I didn't want to hold you back." Thomas's chest tightened. "You're my father. You could never hold me back." They arrived at a small diner on the outskirts of town, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. Thomas parked the truck and turned to Harold. "Let's get something to eat. We can talk more inside." Harold nodded, his expression weary but grateful. Inside the diner, they found a quiet booth near the back. The waitress, a friendly woman with a warm smile, brought them coffee and a couple of hot meals. Harold ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were the first real meal he'd had in days. As they ate, Thomas couldn't shake the image of his father surrounded by those bikers. The anger he'd felt earlier bubbled up again, though this time it was mixed with determination. He wasn't going to let this happen again. Not to his father, not to anyone. "We'll figure this out," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "You're coming home with me." Harold hesitated, looking down at his coffee. "I don't know if I can. That house is not the same without your mother." "It doesn't have to be the same," Thomas said, "but it can be better. We'll fix it together." Harold looked up, his eyes glistening. For the first time in years, Thomas saw a flicker of hope in his father's expression. "All right," Harold said softly. "Let's give it a try." As they left the diner and climbed back into the truck, Thomas felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time it felt like he was heading in the right direction. Together, they would face whatever came next. The morning sun spilled through the curtains of Thomas's old house, bathing the living room in a golden glow. The place felt smaller than he remembered. Dust clung to the furniture, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. It was clear no one had lived here in a long time. Thomas stood in the center of the room, surveying the space with a critical eye, while Harold sat on the worn couch, clutching his old backpack. Thomas set his hands on his hips, taking a deep breath. "It's not much, but it's a start," he said, breaking the silence. "We can fix it up." Harold nodded slowly, his expression a mix of gratitude and hesitation. "I don't want to be in the way, Tommy. You've got your life to think about." Thomas turned to him, his gaze steady. "My life's here now. With you. We'll do this together." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions. Harold looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the worn straps of his backpack. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted quietly. "First, we get this place cleaned up." Thomas said, his tone decisive, one step at a time. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Thomas threw himself into the work with the same discipline that had carried him through years in the military. He scrubbed floors, cleared out cobwebs, and patched up cracks in the walls. Harold helped where he could, though his frail body limited him to lighter tasks like dusting and organizing. At first, he seemed hesitant, as though he didn't believe he belonged there. But as the house began to take shape, so did Harold's confidence. One afternoon, while Thomas was repairing a broken window frame, Harold approached him with a hesitant smile. "You always were good with your hands," he said. "Your mother used to say you got that from me." Thomas paused, looking at his father. "I remember. You taught me how to fix that old rocking chair when I was 10. Harold chuckled softly. "It wobbled no matter what we did, but we got it standing. You were so proud of that chair." The memory brought a faint smile to Thomas's face. "I was proud because you were proud of me." The moment lingered, a small bridge between past and present. Harold seemed to relax a little more after that, his posture less guarded as he continued helping around the house. As the days turned into a week, the house began to feel like a home again. The kitchen was stocked with groceries, the living room was free of clutter, and the once empty walls now held framed photographs Thomas had kept in storage. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Harold glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on a picture of Thomas in his Marine Corps uniform. "I always knew you'd do something big," Harold said, his voice tinged with pride. "Your mother and I used to talk about it all the time. She'd say, 'Our Tommy's gonna make us proud.'" And she was right. Thomas set down his fork, his gaze softening. "I just wish I'd been here more. Maybe things wouldn't have turned out like this." Harold shook his head. "You did what you had to do. You went out and made something of yourself. I'm the one who let things fall apart." The room grew quiet, the weight of Harold's words settling between them. Thomas reached across the table, placing a hand on his father's. "We can't change what happened, Dad, but we can change where we go from here." Harold nodded, his grip tightening briefly around Thomas's hand. "You're right, and I'm grateful for the chance to try." As they cleared the table, Thomas noticed Harold moving with more purpose. The hesitation that had defined his movements when they first arrived was given way to a quiet determination. It wasn't much, but it was progress. The following day, Thomas decided it was time to help Harold reconnect with the world beyond the walls of their home. He took his father to the local community center, a modest building that served as a hub for the town's residents. Inside, they found a small but welcoming group of people. Some were playing cards, while others chatted over cups of coffee. Thomas introduced Harold to a few of the regulars, including Sandra, a kind woman who ran the center. She greeted Harold warmly, her smile putting him at ease. "It's good to see new faces around here," she said. "You're always welcome." Harold's initial response was cautious, but as the day went on, he began to open up. By the time they left, he had exchanged a few stories and even shared a laugh with one of the other seniors. On the drive home, Harold looked out the window, his expression thoughtful. "It's been a long time since I felt like I belonged somewhere," he said. "You belong, Dad," Thomas replied. "Always have." Harold smiled faintly, the lines on his face softening. "Thanks, Tommy, for everything." That night, as Thomas sat in the living room, staring at the flickering light of the television, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. It wasn't perfect, there was still a long road ahead, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, He felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The morning was brisk, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves as Thomas stood on the porch, sipping a mug of coffee. The house was coming together, bit by bit, but there was still plenty of work to do. He glanced over his shoulder to see Harold in the living room, sorting through an old box of photographs and trinkets. For the first time in days, Harold seemed relaxed, almost at peace. Thomas took another sip of coffee, letting the moment settle before setting the mug down and heading inside. "Making progress?" Thomas asked as he crouched next to his father. Harold looked up, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's strange, going through all this. Feels like I'm digging through someone else's life." Thomas picked up a photo from the box, a picture of his parents on their wedding day. His mother's radiant smile seemed to light up the room even now. "It's your life, Dad, and it's worth remembering." Harold nodded, though his eyes carried a hint of sadness. "It's been a long time since I felt like I had one." Thomas didn't press further. He knew this was part of the process, rebuilding not just the house, but his father's sense of self. Over the next few days, they continued to work side by side, repairing, cleaning, and organizing. Harold grew more comfortable in the space, his steps less tentative and his voice steadier. He even began to hum softly to himself as he worked, a habit Thomas remembered from his childhood. One afternoon, as Thomas was fixing the porch railing, a neighbor stopped by. It was Mr. Harris, a retired teacher who lived 2 houses down. He leaned on his cane, watching Thomas work with an approving nod. "Didn't think I'd see anyone back here," Harris said. "This house has been empty for years." "We're fixing it up," Thomas replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "Making it a home again." Harris glanced toward the open door where Harold was visible in the living room. "It's good to see him back. Your dad's been through a lot." Thomas looked at Harris, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Harris sighed, his expression softening. "After your mom passed, he tried to keep it together, but this town, it hasn't been kind to folks like us. He lost his job, then the house. People turned their backs. It wasn't fair." Thomas's jaw tightened, the weight of Harris's words settling over him. "I didn't know." "You were gone, son, doing important things. But your dad, he didn't have anyone to stand by him." Harris patted Thomas on the shoulder. "You're here now. That's what matters." As Harris left, Thomas stood on the porch, his gaze distant. He had always known that life in their town wasn't easy for a black man, especially one of Harold's age and stature. But hearing it laid bare like this filled him with a quiet fury. He made a silent vow to ensure that his father would never have to face that kind of struggle again. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Thomas decided to bring it up. "Mr. Harris stopped by today," he said, keeping his tone neutral. Harold glanced up, his expression guarded. "Oh? What did he say?" "He told me about what happened after Mom died, how the town treated you." Harold sighed, setting down his fork. "There's no point in dwelling on it, Tommy. That's just how things were." "That doesn't make it right," Thomas replied, his voice firm. "You deserved better." Harold gave a small, sad smile. "Maybe, but life doesn't always give you what you deserve." Thomas leaned forward, his gaze intense. "It will now. I'm here, and I'm not going to let anyone treat you like that again." Harold didn't say anything for a long moment, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief. Finally, he nodded. "I appreciate that, son. The following days were a mix of routine and small victories. Harold began to venture out more, joining Thomas on trips to the hardware store or the local market. Each outing seemed to bolster his confidence, and Thomas noticed a change in the way people interacted with his father. Where once there had been indifference or disdain, there was now respect, or at least the beginnings of it. One day, as they walked back to the truck after picking up supplies, Harold turned to Thomas. "You've done more for me in these past few weeks than I could have asked for. I want you to know how much it means." Thomas smiled, clapping a hand on his father's shoulder. "We're in this together, Dad. Always." That night, as they sat on the porch, the stars bright above them, Harold spoke softly. "You know, I used to sit here with your mom, just like this. We'd talk about the future, about all the things we wanted for you." Thomas listened, his heart aching at the weight of his father's words. "You both gave me everything I needed, and now it's my turn to give back." Harold nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that better days were ahead. And as the quiet of the night wrapped around them, Thomas felt a sense of purpose that went beyond anything he had experienced before. This was where he was meant to be, and this was the fight worth fighting. Together, they would reclaim the life they had lost. The morning air was cool and sharp as Thomas drove into town with Harold sitting quietly beside him. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the road. They had received a call from the police earlier that morning, informing them that the bikers who had attacked Harold had been apprehended. Thomas had agreed to come down to the station to provide his testimony and ensure that justice was served. Harold looked out the window, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. "I don't know if I want to see them again, Tommy," he said softly. "Those men, they reminded me of all the worst parts of this town." Thomas kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tightening. "I know, Dad, but this is our chance to hold them accountable. They don't get to walk away from what they did." When they arrived at the station, a young officer greeted them and escorted them to a small conference room where Detective Collins was waiting. The detective was a seasoned man with a weathered face, his sharp eyes betraying a no-nonsense attitude. "Mr. Williams," Collins said, shaking Thomas's hand firmly before turning to Harold. "And Mr. Harold Williams, I presume. It's good to meet you both." Harold nodded politely, but remained silent. Thomas stepped forward. "We're here to give our statements." Collins motioned for them to sit and began laying out the process. "We've already got the bikers in custody," he said. "They've been charged with assault, theft, and possession of a weapon. But your testimony is going to be crucial to make the charges stick." Thomas recounted the events of that day with precision, his military training evident in the way he described every detail. When Collins asked Harold to speak, the older man hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. Thomas reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his father's arm. "It's okay, Dad. Just tell them what happened." Harold took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice was shaky at first, but as he continued, a quiet strength emerged. He described the taunts, the violence, and the humiliation he had endured at the hands of the bikers. By the time he finished, the room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. "Thank you, Mr. Williams," Collins said, his tone respectful. "You've been through a lot. We'll make sure these men face justice." As they left the station, Harold looked visibly lighter, as though unburdened by finally telling his story. Thomas glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You did good, Dad." Harold chuckled softly. I'm just glad it's over." But Thomas knew it wasn't entirely over. Justice might take its course, but the scars of what had happened and the years of hardship that preceded it would take time to heal. A week later, the trial began. Thomas and Harold sat in the courthouse, surrounded by a small crowd of reporters, townsfolk, and other onlookers. The bikers were seated at the defense table, their arrogance noticeably diminished. The leader, the same man who had pulled a knife on Thomas, avoided eye contact as the proceedings began. The prosecutor, a sharp and confident woman named Valerie Knight, wasted no time laying out the case. She described the bikers' history of harassment and intimidation, painting a clear picture of their pattern of behavior. When Thomas was called to the stand, he spoke with the same clarity and composure he had shown at the station, recounting the events in detail. The defense attorney attempted to paint the bikers as misguided rather than malicious, but their efforts fell flat when Harold took the stand. His quiet but powerful testimony moved the courtroom, leaving no doubt about the intent behind the attack. By the time he stepped down, the bikers' fate seemed all but sealed. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. The bikers were found guilty on all counts, including assault with a deadly weapon. The judge's sentencing was swift and decisive. The leader received a 10-year prison sentence, while the others were given lesser but still significant terms. As they were led away in handcuffs, Thomas felt a sense of vindication, not just for his father, but for everyone in the town who had suffered under their reign of terror. Outside the courthouse, Harold stood quietly, his hands in his pockets. Thomas joined him, the two of them watching as the crowd began to disperse. "It's done," Thomas said. "They won't be hurting anyone else." Harold nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's strange. I've spent so long feeling powerless. It feels good to finally stand up for myself." "You should never have had to go through it in the first place," Thomas replied. "But you did, and you came out stronger." Harold smiled faintly. "Maybe I did, thanks to you." As they walked back to the truck, the sun began to set, casting the town in a warm glow. For the first time in a long time, Harold felt a sense of hope. And for Thomas, it was a reminder that some battles were fought not on distant shores, but right at home. Together, they were ready to face whatever came next. The house was quiet as Thomas and Harold sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, but for the first time, there was a sense of calm between them. The bikers were behind bars, and the trial had not only brought justice, but it also rekindled Harold's faith in himself and in the town he once called home. Harold leaned back in his chair, a steaming cup of tea in his hands. His face, though still etched with lines of hardship, looked more relaxed than Thomas could remember. "I never thought I'd feel at peace here again," Harold said, his voice quiet but steady. Thomas glanced over at him, a faint smile on his lips. "You're not alone anymore, Dad. That makes all the difference." Harold nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It does. And it's because of you. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." "You don't have to," Thomas replied, his tone firm but warm. "You're my father. This is what family does." For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the soft chirping of crickets filling the air. Harold took a sip of his tea, then set the cup down on the small table between them. "You know," he began, his voice tinged with a hint of reflection, "when your mother and I bought this house, we used to dream about the life we'd build here. It was supposed to be our haven, a place where we could grow old together. After she passed, I thought I'd lost all of that." Thomas shifted in his chair, his eyes softening. "You didn't lose it, Dad. It was always here, waiting for you. You just needed a reason to come back." Harold looked at his son, his expression both grateful and contemplative. "And you were that reason. I was so caught up in my own pride, my own pain, that I couldn't see what I still had. You reminded me." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat but swallowed it down. "We both made mistakes," he said, "but we're here now. That's what matters." The conversation drifted to lighter topics as the evening wore on. They talked about the repairs they still needed to make to the house, the neighbors who had stopped by to welcome Harold back, and the possibility of planting a small garden in the spring. Harold even joked about finding an old rocking chair to fix up together, a nod to a memory that had become a symbol of their bond. As the sky darkened, Thomas stood and stretched. "I'll grab us some blankets. It's getting chilly out here." Harold nodded, watching as his son disappeared into the house. When Thomas returned, he draped a blanket over Harold's lap and handed him another cup of tea. They settled back into their chairs, the warmth of the blankets warding off the cool night air. The stars began to appear, one by one, dotting the sky with their faint glow. Harold tilted his head back, taking in the sight. "You know, your mother loved sitting out here at night. She used to say the stars made her feel small, but in a good way, like there was something bigger out there, watching over us." Thomas looked up, the stars reflected in his dark eyes. She was right. There's something comforting about it. Like no matter how big our problems feel, they're just a small part of something much greater. Harold smiled, his expression serene. "I think she'd be proud of us, Tommy, of the life we're starting to build again." Thomas nodded, his voice soft. "I know she would." The quiet of the night settled over them, and for the first time in years, Harold felt truly at home. The weight of the past no longer pressed so heavily on his shoulders, and the fear and shame that had kept him isolated were beginning to fade. With Thomas by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. As the hours passed, the two men sat together, wrapped in the warmth of their newfound connection. The house, once a hollow shell of memories, now felt alive again. It was a symbol of resilience, of family, and of the strength it took to rebuild from the ashes of hardship. When Harold finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Tommy, for coming back, for giving me hope." Thomas reached over, clasping his father's hand in his. "We did this together, Dad, and we'll keep moving forward, no matter what." The stars continued to shine above them as father and son sat on the porch, the promise of a brighter future stretching out before them. Together, they had reclaimed their home, their family, and their hope. And together, they knew they could face whatever lay ahead. The journey of courage, family, and resilience reminds us all of the power of standing together and facing life's challenges head-on. What would you do in such a situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and share this video. Let's keep the conversation going about strength, hope, and justice.